mic check, please.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings.
I'm your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
My name is John Gordon. I'll be your host.
And I'm your host, Katie Burke.
Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America. We bring the resource to you, the DU Podcast.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Ducks Unlimited podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jennings. Joining me in studio today is Kevin Kraai, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Waterfowl Program Leader. Kevin, welcome back to the DU podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. I've always enjoyed visiting with you guys, and I'm more than happy to get on here and talk with y'all, and as well as our hunters.
So before we get into the current habitat conditions and what hunters are kind of looking at right now, I know we're a little bit early in the season, but it's always good to get a preview. Let's talk about last season and how you guys kind of went into the season with some really good looking habitat in most of the state. And then it kind of fell off and everything kind of went stale. And then in January, it kind of picked up again for hunters. That's kind of what I heard. I mean, I'm sure that you probably heard very similar, but you know, how did last season really shape up for Texas waterfowl hunters?
Well, ultimately it was a considerable decrease in our harvest estimates, somewhere around 40% decline in total numbers of ducks shot in Texas from the previous season. And then with geese, about a 35% decline. So, yeah, I mean, it was pretty correlative to what we were hearing. As you mentioned, things did pick up right there towards the end. We finally started getting some good cold fronts and new birds moving in. That really helped bolster things. But by and far, it was, pretty frustrating for a lot of people. I mean, we had, Texas, like you just mentioned, we have, it's almost like 5 different states when you start thinking about the diversity of the state from north, south, east, west. And so being able to blanketly make a comment about, everybody's hunting across the state is very difficult. It changes as you move around the state. And yeah, there were portions of the state that, just basically never had any good habitat throughout most of the year. And then there was, as usual, there's always some that do and some that have very successful seasons. So it's one of those things. But as a whole, I think we were down quite a bit from the previous season.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what I heard, just kind of, through the grapevine, some people that I talked to down in South Texas, and then there's a couple in North Texas where, very similar. It slowed down, then it kind of picked up at the end. Everyone seemed to be happy with the season just based on the last couple of weeks. It was like,
right.
That stale December was out of sight, out of mind right. By the time they got some fronts and kind of shifted things around. But, moving into this season, I think this is probably a good thing to do for our audience to get, like you mentioned, just a better understanding of the different habitat types throughout the state of Texas. And we've done this before on the podcast, a couple years ago. But for our new listeners, I think it'd be a good idea for you to kind of break down the different regions throughout Texas, how you look at waterfowl habitat throughout the entire state and how it's kind of broken down.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we actually fly our midwinter surveys and do our planning and, the 10,000 foot level look at the state, we break the state up into what we call ecoregions. And there's 5 or 6 of those throughout the state that we monitor, and we're able to compare back, to previous years' surveys and data, and kind of get an idea, a really good idea, if you will, of some distributional shifts and be able to track that. And those ecoregions are literally set out there by habitat type. And so, like I said, there's a wide variety of them. And starting from the north going south, we have what we call the high plains, also known as the Texas Panhandle. And then, the dominant wetland feature and waterfowl feature in that landscape is playa wetlands. Very ephemeral, shallow, discs of water on the landscape that historically had a lot of irrigation runoff due to agricultural practices, and that practice has changed dramatically in the way at which we deliver water more efficiently to crops up here. And so those features, those wetland basins, now have to rely 100% on Mother Nature and to fill up. And it has to be a pretty substantial event to fill those things up. We're not talking a half inch of rain to put water in these things. Sometimes you're talking 4 and 5, 6 inches, which is, some years is, a quarter of our annual rainfall. So it takes a very substantial rain event to put water in this landscape and those playas. And so we've had a number of years now in a row where they've been very, very dry. And that's been reflected very strongly in our data associated with harvest of ducks and just basically finding wetlands on the landscape. Geese up here are real adaptive, and they'll go straight to the city limits and hang out in city parks. And so they've kind of figured that game out, but ducks still rely on those wetlands. And as you move south and a little east, we enter what we call the rolling plains. The rolling plains is basically, say, from Childress to Fort Worth, down to San Angelo and Abilene. And it's great, big country, wide open country. That the dominant feature on that landscape is man-made ponds or stock ponds. And they're not insignificant. There's so many of them. It's kind of impressive when you get up in the air and look at that landscape. From a duck's view, how much water is on that landscape. All those things were put there largely for agricultural purposes, some recreational, but that's something that is new for the most part, especially to a duck's evolutionary process of having those ponds on the landscape. And some years, very interestingly, we've counted more ducks in the rolling plains than we have on the Gulf Coast, just because there's so much abundance of water, small ponds, very, very high densities in places up to 7 per square mile. And then, it's no secret, ducks don't like being shot at. So when you couple, abundance of fresh water in an area where there's little pressure, birds will find those landscapes pretty quickly, matter of fact. And so, that's a pretty unique rolling landscape with a bunch of man-made ponds across it. And then as we go east from there, we have what we call the Oakwoods and Blackland Prairie. That's basically Dallas down to Waco and over to what I call the Pine Curtain, deep East Texas. So it's kind of that transition from prairie into forest. Again, very historically important area for waterfowl in Texas. Definitely has even a higher abundance of stock ponds than the rolling plains. You also start getting into a lot of reservoirs and creeks and rivers, bottomland hardwoods, floodplains. And so that landscape, again, driven by stock ponds, but when you get rain events and you start getting those flood events, that's what really, really draws ducks to the Northeast Texas landscape. And last year we just didn't have any of those big flood events. And so that really kind of hurt us in that regard. So when you get the Trinity River and the Sabine River and the Sulphur River out of their banks and flooded off into those backwoods, that's an attractant of monumental proportions. You can literally watch ducks arrive and as that flood event occurs. And so that's what really drives that landscape. And we just haven't had a lot of those good, timely flood events at the right time of year in the last few years. So, fingers crossed that changes this year. And it's a real draw for us in that landscape because there simply isn't any agriculture, outside of the playas, the Panhandle and the Gulf Coast, really in Texas, that is valuable for waterfowl. It's just the timing of harvest is off. And so, the ducks outside of the high plains and the Gulf Coast really got to make a living in the water at which they swim. They're not flying out to cornfields. They're not flying out to the Milo or even peanut fields. The peanut industry's changed so much. There's just tiny pockets of peanuts left in the state of Texas. So those water bodies are really where the birds have to make their living. And so from there, we move further east into what we call the Piney Woods. And it's just basically a sliver of deep East Texas along the Louisiana border, largely driven by reservoirs and, again, some floodplain rivers and things like that. It's just not traditionally a real ducky area because it just is a permanent water type scenario, not a lot of high value productive wetlands in that landscape. Although there is a lot of water and it's a very high rain part of the state, there's just not a lot. We don't count a lot of ducks in that landscape. And so from there we go down to what we call the Gulf Coast prairies and marshes, and that's everything from pretty much Beaumont, Texas, almost all the way down to Corpus Christi, and then it goes inland. We're obviously dealing with our bays, and estuaries, and marshes, and then inland to our, our famed, if you will, rice agricultural regions. So this is obviously arguably our most important waterfowl region in the state. It's where most of our hunters occur, where most of our harvest occurs. And historically, it's one of the most important areas in all of North America for wintering and migrating waterfowl. So this is a very high importance area for us. And we do a lot of work, a lot of research, a lot of habitat delivery. Most of our public lands for waterfowl hunting that the state owns and operates are in this landscape. And so, yeah, it's a real important area for us, and it definitely is a high priority. And from there, you kind of go over what we have this little bitty tiny piece called the sand plain. It's a little wetland, or a little area just south of Corpus Christi and north of Brownsville that has some. It's kind of almost in the brush country, but it has some isolated playa almost like wetlands, which, when they're wet are very good and very productive. And they happen to be very wet right now. One of the few places we've had in the state of Texas that has had a lot of rain this summer. And as of late is that deep South Texas brush country. And you get into the sand plain and our brush country ecoregion. That's our last one is the brush country, and that's basically San Antonio, Laredo south, all the way to Brownsville. Very similar to the rolling plains. About the only water feature in that landscape is stock ponds, man-made bodies of water that people put out there, either for livestock or recreation. And when it's wet in that landscape, ducks really like it. Again, very similar to the rolling plains. There's not a lot of pressure. There's that landscape's there. For cows and bobwhite quail and white-tailed deer. So those ducks like that. The ducks like that refuge, if you will, of being able to get out there and away from other ducks. That's one thing people don't think about much is once you get to a certain point of your life cycle, your annual life cycle, and you pair with a mate, you don't want to be around other ducks. So you get real. You don't want your mate stolen. And so you're going to go off and hide. And that has huge impacts on duck behavior and hunter success, especially as you get later into the season. The really, really healthy ducks, especially hens that are, have a lot of fat content and are working their way through their annual cycle and are dealing with molt and have paired, they're going to go off and hide and not be gregarious at all. The last thing in the world they want to do is go land with a bunch of plastic lookalikes. So that's where those ponds really come into play. That later in that season is as those birds begin to pair up and go through their molt, they're going to leave some of those big, more traditional areas like East Texas and the Gulf Coast to go hide literally out in those ponds and continue that pair bond process in preparation for breeding. And so it's kind of a very important role, and those ponds are serving that role very well.
Hey, I think this is a great opportunity right here. We're just going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Kevin Kraai. Before we get into this current state of habitat throughout Texas, let's do a little recap on, because we didn't have typically we've always had you on the week before your teal season opens, and time got away from us this year, and but just kind of a wrap up on what you heard from the early teal season there in Texas.
Well, it was definitely as usual in this big state. It was lots of mixed reports.
Yep.
There's, just prior to teal season, let's just kind of back up even further. April through July was just pretty much horrendous across the state of Texas this year. Extremely hot, extremely windy. very, very poor conditions for wetlands.
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting about that is when you think about wetlands is they need a dry period so that they can, grow foods. I mean, that's the stuff you're trying to propagate to feed ducks later. So that dry period is actually quite important. It's also very important for managers because you're able to get in there and do soil disturbance and maintenance and things like that didn't, when it's wet, you can't do.
Mm-hmm.
And so in reality, it's actually a good thing sometimes to have those really good dry periods to kind of reset things, reset the table. Speaking of East Texas, one of the things that is really important is that dry period throughout the summer, because those reservoirs, the majority of our public hunting is on public reservoirs in that landscape. And when those reservoirs are low during the summer months, the exposed shoreline is growing duck foods rapidly. And so obviously they just kind of turned themselves into giant moist soil units. That's what we call our management units, where we're managing water levels to promote more growth of food. So all those reservoirs in East Texas are acting as giant moist soil units as we speak. So all those reservoirs were way, way low. And lots of good terrestrial vegetation is growing up around the edges. And, right now we're just waiting for, the refilling of them, the flood to come back and fill it all back up and put water back into those back coves and whatnot where all that food is. So that dry period actually is good. It is beneficial to ducks in a lot of ways. August rolled around and things really started rapidly changing. Just prior to teal season, I think I gave 2 or 3 different interviews and they were all wrong within like 24 hours.
That's how it works.
Things are changing. Yeah, exactly. And what I'm going to say here today is going to be wrong probably in a week.
Mm-hmm.
So either way, things rapidly changed, which for the good. We started getting really wet in a lot of areas. The High Plains, the Panhandle, Lubbock and Amarillo area got water for the first time in a long time. And so like literally overnight, we have a numerous wet basin, playa basins that haven't seen water in years. Deep South Texas, holy cow. It was very bad timing because we were trying to do a new research project on mottle ducks where we needed to trap a bunch. And they got 600 to 700% above their normal rainfall south of San Antonio to the Mexican border.
Holy moly. And
just spread all of our ducks out. Yeah, just spread all of our ducks out all over the landscape and just kind of ruined the project this year. So, but that did touch some parts of the Gulf Coast too.
Mm-hmm.
Just prior to the teal season, people were really nervous. They were not seeing teal. Habitat was poor and things changed so quick, just literally overnight. And that really helped things a lot. So East Texas Dallas got one huge event. Probably, I think it was a record event, a rain event that the Trinity River oddly flooded in a weird time of year, very briefly, and got out of its banks. But I'm sure that helped some. But we still need a lot of rain in Northeast Texas, and that was a pretty isolated area where that rain fell too. So for the most part, other than South Texas, the Gulf Coast and the Panhandle, it was pretty dry in Texas for teal season. So I suspect harvest will reflect that when we get the numbers back. Gulf Coast, our public lands along the Gulf Coast itself saw some of the lowest success rates we've had in many, many years. We continue to be very crowded, even turn away hunters on some of our public areas. But even with those real timely rains just prior to the season, there was still not as much habitat as we like. So we weren't able to hunt all the spots we normally get to hunt down there. But you go inland just a handful of miles and you start getting into that rice country and you start getting into some of those properties where people are intensively managing and have the luxury of access to water and the luxury of being able to rotate things and hunt lightly. They were having an unbelievable season, or they had an unbelievable season.
Yeah.
Many clubs, many leases had all-time record, success and harvest. So it's one of those little stories where it's just, it depends on where you're at that day. Unfortunately, it wasn't a blanket across the state excellent teal season.
Yeah.
but some certainly had some amazing teal hunting for sure.
And how did you hear from any of the guys who actually were hunting along the coast, like in the marshes out there? I mean, I know that can change. One good weather event there can help those guys out significantly. And they didn't really get it until almost a little too late, right?
Yeah. So no, they didn't. There was a little uptick there right at the last weekend of the season. But yeah, I mean, most of our properties we hunt Saturday, Sunday, and I always see a big drop off on that Sunday. Yeah. And it was, like I said, it was some of the lowest birds per hunter on our coastal WMAs that we've seen in many years. So conditions right along the coast in that marsh were not great for teal this year.
And the interesting part of that is even some of the migration alert guys that the freelance riders that I have, I mean, they're in South Dakota, North Dakota. Some even spent some time in Canada last week, and they're like, dude, there's still blue wings everywhere up here. Yeah. So
no, I'm hearing the same.
Yeah, and I'm sure that most of your hunters down there have heard that story too, that, maybe the conditions in the prairies or in the U.S. prairies were significantly, so strong that maybe that kind of held those birds there for just a little longer, that kind of put them out of play. Yeah,
so, I mean, all the way up until the last day, they were banning ducks in the Dakotas and in Montana, which is, well into September. They were still seeing blue wings. So, I mean, that's technically not anything new. I know when I was flying white-fronted goose surveys in Canada a few years back, we would always see blue wings, all the way up until October, there'd still be blue wings. So there's just a lot of blue wings. I mean, there's millions of blue wings. Yeah. So, luckily there's lots of waves of them come and go. And we did. I mean, we ultimately found out that production for blue wings was really good this year. So there's lots of young in that flock. One of the few species we have that did really, really well this year. So there's just a lot of them. And there were blue wings moving through here in middle of August, and there still will be come, this week and next week probably. So,
I think it's hard for.
It's just kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of hard for someone who doesn't really have like a continental perspective. For, because guys down in South Texas are like, oh, we just picked up blue wings. Well, a guy in Oklahoma hears that and he's like, oh, Texas has got all blue wings. Well, in reality, there are blue wings from Saskatoon to, probably south of Texas for that.
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, they're way south of Texas already.
Yeah.
So yeah. So they're stretched out. They'll get all concentrated here real soon. Yeah. But that's one cool thing about blue wings is, historically there wasn't a lot of harvest availability after teal season. And for some of the southern states, especially Texas, they're becoming our bread and butter duck throughout the season. So historically they would vacate Texas, even they'd go further south into Mexico and South America, all of them. And we just wouldn't see blue wings during the regular season. And now we're seeing blue wings throughout the entire regular season along the Texas coast almost every year.
Yeah. I mean, I'd take that as a bonus. If I was down there, that would be a good thing.
Well, I mean, they're not only abundant down there, but they're also beautiful. They start getting their colors, and so they're kind of a trophy for sure.
So going into, like I said, I mentioned earlier, we are a little early here. We're first week of October here. Looking at kind of a preview for regular season waterfowl in Texas. We are just a tidbit early, but kind of give us an overview of how the habitat conditions have kind of come together, even after those, like you mentioned, you got some water just before teal season in some areas, but how's it all looking right now?
Well, kind of like I said earlier, right before teal season, I gave a crystal ball view, and a few days later it changed. And so I'm sure they'll do the same here, but things have already changed a lot since teal season, or at least while teal season was even going on. So like I said, August was amazing. August was one of the nicest, wettest, coolest August I ever remember, which is pretty rare for Texas, to say the least. And basically everything completely changed when September rolled around. It got very, very warm again and hot in most places, and it really hasn't rained anywhere in the state in the entire month of September. And so things have really gone downhill again for wetland conditions, to say the least. So even deep southeast Texas, where we have 50 plus inches of rain, I don't know if they got an inch of rain in the month of September. Wow. So it's we're way behind rainfall for the month of September. And then looking at long-term forecasts across the state, there's just essentially no chances of precip, with the small exception of the Panhandle has a pretty good chance of rain for the next few days. So precip is just basically unheard of right now in the forecast for the state of Texas, and that's a big area.
Oh yeah.
So again, things are looking down, to say the least. People are gonna, like I was talking about earlier, those guys that intensively manage, they're gonna have to turn their pumps back on or somehow get canal water again, because things are looking pretty bad now. That could all change. Very,
I was going to say, well, you said,
and obviously we hope it does.
Yeah, it's going to change. So maybe that's for the better that you say, oh, it's not looking very good.
No, I think that's me. I mean, I think I'm the one that turns on the water machine when I start speaking gloom and doom. So anyway, no, it's we definitely need it right now. About the only water we have available for migrating wintering waterfowl is man-made stuff.
Yeah.
More permanent waters, ponds, reservoirs. That's the water we have available to them. Our marshes are very, very salty right now. Salinity levels are through the roof. So we didn't grow lots of good foods in our marshes like we like when you have good freshwater inputs regularly. And so, those type of conditions are going to greatly impact hunting success if something doesn't change pretty soon.
Yeah. And exactly, just to give people an idea, and even, you can judge it by region, like what does it take to improve, like the, Piney Woods area, like those reservoirs? Is it going to take a 7-inch rain to make a difference? Yeah. Okay. I just wanted you to kind of clarify.
Yeah. So I mean, the other thing is you're obviously talking soil moisture is very, very low, and so these are wetlands. They're clay soils, and so those are shrink swell soils. So for rain events to start having significant impact and start ponding water, and lake levels to rise, and for rivers to flood, you're going to need a lot of rain just to close the cracks in the ground.
Yeah.
So it's going to take a while. The perfect scenarios, those long, drippy week-long type events that, slowly close the cracks and then things start filling up. But it's going to take an extreme weather change to really start ponding water on this landscape. I've seen it over and over again. By the time we get to December or January, the state is wet as can be, and there's water everywhere, and sheet water and things like that. So that's kind of what our hope is right now, that event and multiple events occur. The last thing in the world we want is some kind of a nasty storm coming out of the Gulf. So luckily we've been able to knock on wood there so far. This is we just need some good cold fronts, that big low pressure systems with them, and bring lots of rain and new ducks regularly.
And that's, so that's what, Texas waterfowlers should be kind of eyeballing that forecast for, is, really looking for those multiple back-to-back-to-back systems that will drench that whole region and the whole state, for that matter. Yes. Sounds like you need it. Before I get you out of here, one quick question, though. You mentioned your midwinter surveys. When do you do those? Typically
the first week of January. Weather permitting. Yeah. And so, we do those every year around January. And by the time we get surveys completed and data analyzed and summarized, unfortunately, it's right around the end of duck season before we get that information out. But that's when we do it every year.
I think we did the show last year in February. I think kind of your wrap up of your guys' it was like the first week of February by the time we were able to get you on here. And we'll definitely plan on doing that again for sure.
No, absolutely. Yeah, that's a good time to talk about the season and compare to what our data showed. And so that'd be a great time to get back together.
And before we get you out of here, is there anything else that you kind of want to mention to Texas waterfowlers this year?
Like I said, we're just hoping that we get some different weather. I mean, it's ironic. Yep. As soon as we say that, we'll probably be saying there's too much water. So we're like farmers these days. So, it's just one of those things that I wish every corner of the state had excellent duck hunting. Obviously, it's just so big and so vast, and ducks have wings for a reason. They're going to go wherever they can get to find the resources they need and not be disturbed. And so that's what we're seeing, when we talk about our midwinter data and those distributional shifts. It is blatantly glaring of an example of ducks wanting to be away from humans as you could possibly imagine. So, I know it's hard to do, but pressure changes everything. And, when people hunt one spot and hunt it regularly, they're going to get frustrated. That's for sure. These birds are not going to put up with it anymore. And so that just changes the way people hunt. That's for sure.
Well, I think we could kind of look at Texas, especially with the weather that they need, is just kind of typical waterfowlers optimism is needed. We'll go ahead and go into the season with it like that. I think that's great.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, cool, Kevin. I appreciate you taking the time to join us today. I think waterfowlers throughout the state and in other states surrounding can definitely benefit from listening to this and just kind of hearing what the conditions are like and what's needed to really improve those habitat conditions in Texas.
Yeah, anytime, Chris. Really enjoy it.
All right. Thanks a lot, Kevin.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank my guest, Kevin Kraai, for coming on and giving a full overview of kind of Texas habitat conditions, a look back at teal season, and really what's needed to improve those habitat conditions across the state. I'd like to thank our producer, Chris Isaac, for putting the show together and getting it out to you. And I'd like to thank you, the listener, for joining us on the DU podcast and supporting wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show, and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks. Stay tuned to the Ducks.